My name is Nora, and this story begins with a night I'll never forget. A night that started with laughter, clinking glasses, and the familiar hum of my family's chatter, and ended with me standing alone outside, holding my breath in the cold, trying not to cry. But before I tell you about that night, the family party where my own father told me to leave, I need to tell you how it all began. Because like most painful stories, it didn't start with cruelty. It started with love. I grew up as the middle child in a family of 5. My father, Robert, was a proud man, respected in our small town, known for running his own construction business. My mother, Linda, was soft-spoken, the kind of woman who smiled even when she was exhausted. I had an older sister, Sarah, who could do no wrong in my father's eyes, and a younger brother, Ethan, who was the golden boy funny, charming, and spoiled in quiet ways that no one acknowledged out loud. And then there was me, the one who never seemed to fit neatly into their expectations. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't wild. I was just different. I had opinions, dreams, and boundaries that didn't always align with what my family thought I should have. My father believed in strength, control, and tradition. I believed in kindness, effort, and understanding. It sounds small, but in our house, those differences grew into walls. When I married Daniel, my father's disappointment became open disapproval. Daniel wasn't from our circle. He was an architect, quiet, thoughtful, not flashy. He didn't come from money. He worked for everything he had. My father didn't respect that. He used to say, "You marry someone who can take care of you." Nora, not someone still trying to take care of himself. But I loved Daniel for that exact reason. Because he worked hard. Because he was humble. Because he made me feel seen in a way no one else ever did. We'd been married for 3 years when the party happened, my father's 60th birthday celebration. It was a big event. He rented a hall, invited over 100 people, family, friends, old business partners. It was supposed to be a night of pride and joy. I remember standing in front of the mirror that evening, adjusting my dress, Daniel's reflection appearing behind me as he said softly, "You look beautiful." "Ready?" I smiled, though my stomach was tight with nerves. As ready as I'll ever be. We arrived early. The place was already buzzing with laughter and music. My father stood near the stage, glass in hand, laughing with Sarah and her husband, Brian, who, by the way, my father adored because Brian worked in finance and had that polished confidence that impressed people like him. When my father saw us, his smile faded just a bit. It was subtle, but I caught it. "Nora," he said with a tone too formal for a family gathering. Daniel smiled politely and offered a handshake. "Happy birthday, sir." My father took it, though his grip looked more like a test than a greeting. "Thank you." "I'm surprised you made it," he said, voice loud enough for others to hear. I swallowed hard. "Of course we did." "It's your day." He nodded but turned back to his conversation before I could say more. That was how it always went, polite, cold, and distant. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table as we sat down later. "It's okay," he whispered. "You don't owe anyone anything tonight. Let's just enjoy it." But that wasn't easy. All through dinner, my father kept finding ways to draw comparisons between Daniel and Brian. Brian's firm just expanded again. He said at one point, pride swelling in his voice. "Now, that's what I call ambition." Then, with a pointed glance toward Daniel, he added, "Some people just have that spark, you know?" The table laughed politely. I didn't. I just pressed my lips together and focused on my plate. Daniel stayed calm. He always did. But I could feel the tension in the way his fingers tapped gently against his glass. After dinner, speeches began. My mother gave a sweet, short one. Sarah followed, her words perfectly polished as always. Then my father took the microphone. He started with jokes, stories about his youth, his work, his values. He thanked everyone for being there. Then his tone shifted. "And of course," he said, "I couldn't have come this far without my family. My wonderful wife, my 2 incredible children, Sarah and Ethan, who've made me proud every single day." The room clapped. I froze. He hadn't said my name. I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he'd come back to it. But he didn't. He kept talking about Sarah's achievements, Ethan's new job, even Brian's promotion. And when I caught my mother's eyes from across the table, I saw the flicker of guilt there. She knew. When he finally turned toward me, it wasn't to praise. It was to make a point. "And then there's Nora," he said with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My middle one, the independent thinker of the family. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. She's always done things her own way. Married a man who, he paused, scanning Daniel from head to toe. Well, let's just say a man still trying to find his footing. The laughter this time was louder. I wanted to disappear. My chest tightened. I could feel the blood rush to my face. Daniel's hand found mine again under the table, squeezing, grounding me. But then my father said it. The words that broke something in me that night. You know, Nora, he said into the microphone, sometimes in life you have to accept that your choices have consequences. You wanted your own path, you got it? But maybe this family gathering I sent you the right place for people who've chosen to step away from what this family stands for. A stunned silence followed. I stared at him, not fully processing what he meant, until he said it clearly, each word cutting through the air. Nora, I think it's best you leave. My fork clattered onto the plate. For a moment, I thought it was a cruel joke, but no one laughed. The only sound was the faint music still playing from the speakers. My mother's lips parted like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Sarah looked away. Ethan just sat there, eyes wide, pretending not to exist. I stood up slowly, my hands trembling. You're serious? I whispered. My father didn't even look ashamed. Yes, I'm serious. And before I could find the words, before the tears could even reach my eyes, Daniel stood too. He placed his napkin down neatly and said, in that calm, firm voice of his, You don't talk to my wife that way. Every head turned toward him. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His words carried a quiet authority that silenced the room. Robert, he said, using my father's name for the first time ever, you may not respect me. That's fine. But you don't get to humiliate Nora in front of people and call it pride. She's done nothing but love you, and you treat her like a stranger because she chose love over money. That's on you, not her. I could see my father's jaw tighten. He wasn't too used to anyone, especially not a man like Daniel, talking to him like that. The air in the room grew heavy. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it would break through my ribs. Daniel turned to me, his voice softer now. Let's go, Nora. You don't need to stay where you're not respected. I hesitated for a second, long enough to see the mix of faces staring at us. Pity, discomfort, judgment. My mother's eyes were glossy, but she still didn't move. So I nodded, lifted my chin, and walked out with Daniel. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. I remember the way the streetlight hit the wet pavement, how the music from the hall faded as the door closed behind us. I felt small but oddly free. Daniel wrapped his coat around my shoulders and said softly, You don't have to prove anything to him anymore. That night, we drove home in silence. I didn't cry until we were in bed, and even then, the tears weren't just from pain. They were from clarity. Because in that moment, I realized something. My father hadn't just disrespected me. He underestimated me, and someday he would see exactly what I was capable of. He would see what real strength looks like, calm, quiet, and unshakable. And that was the night my revenge began. It wasn't the kind of revenge people imagine, loud or cruel. Mine would be patient, steady, and built from everything he said I couldn't do. It would take time. It would take pain. But I would get there, and when I did, he wouldn't see a defeated daughter. He'd see the woman he tried to tear down, standing taller than ever. That night after the party, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside me. My mind replayed every word my father had said, every smirk, every small laugh that followed. It wasn't just humiliation, it was betrayal. I had known he disapproved of my choices, but I never thought he would cast me out of his life so publicly. For days afterward, I couldn't bring myself to call anyone, not my mother. Not Sarah, not even Ethan. I didn't want pity or empty apologies. I wanted space. And maybe, somewhere deep down, I wanted to disappear long enough that they would notice my absence. Daniel, as always, gave me that space without asking questions. He cooked for me, checked in gently, and kept things going at his firm even when he knew his mind was partly on me. He had this calm strength, not loud or dramatic, just steady. I think that's what saved me from breaking completely. A week later, my mother called. Her voice was soft, careful. Nora, sweetheart, can we talk? I almost didn't answer, but something in me needed closure. Sure, I said, trying to sound neutral. She started by apologizing. What your father did was wrong. He knows that too. I stopped her there. Please don't say he didn't mean it. He meant every word. There was silence on the line, then she sighed. He's stubborn, Nora. He doesn't like being challenged. You know how he is. I know exactly how he is, I said quietly. That's the problem. She hesitated, then said, he's planning to visit Sarah next week. Maybe he could drop by too. I'll talk to him. We can, I interrupted again. Mom, I'm not coming, not yet. Her voice cracked a little. You're his daughter, Nora. He loves you. I closed my eyes, feeling a sting behind them. Love doesn't look like that, Mom. Not to me. After that call, I made a promise to myself, not out of anger, but out of resolve. I wasn't going to beg for acceptance anymore. I had spent my entire life trying to make my father proud, and what had it gotten me? Nothing but disappointment. So I decided to shift that energy inward. If my father thought I wasn't good enough, then fine. I'd stop trying to be. Instead, I'd become better, not for him, but for myself. That was the seed of my quiet revenge. Daniel supported me completely. We decided to move closer to the city where his work opportunities were better. It meant leaving the comfort of our small community and starting over, but I was ready for that. We found a small apartment near downtown. It wasn't luxurious, but it was ours, with sunlight streaming through the big window in the kitchen and the faint sounds of traffic below that reminded me we were in a place full of motion, full of possibilities. I got a job at an interior design studio. I had always loved design, colors, textures, the way spaces could change how people felt. My father had dismissed it as a hobby once, but this time I was determined to make it more than that. The studio wasn't big, just 6 employees, but it had warmth, creativity, and an owner, Maya, who believed in giving people chances. She saw something in me that my family never did. You've got an eye for balance, she told me one afternoon as I rearranged the sample boards. And patience, that's rare in this field. I think you could go far, Nora. I remember smiling for the first time in weeks. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. Those months were healing in slow, quiet ways. Every small success, every client who liked my ideas, every project that came together stitched a little piece of me back. I started to realize that revenge didn't always have to be about payback. Sometimes it was about rebuilding yourself so completely that the people who broke you couldn't recognize you anymore. But still, there were moments when the hurt came back, late at night, when I thought about how easily my father had discarded me. I'd picture him laughing with Sarah and Ethan, proud of them, while I was just gone. One evening, Daniel found me sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights. He placed a cup of tea beside me. You're thinking about him again, he said softly. I nodded. It's strange. I don't miss the fights. I just miss belonging, I guess. Daniel sat beside me and said something I never forgot. You belong wherever you be respected. Nora, family isn't about blood. It's about dignity. Those words stayed with me. 2 years passed like that, quietly, steadily. Daniel's firm grew. He earned a promotion and started leading his own projects. I rose through the studio ranks too, becoming one of the lead designers. I even started getting freelance offers, small ones at first, then bigger ones. One client, a woman named Mrs. Lang, was so happy with my work that she introduced me to her husband, who happened to own a chain of boutique hotels. That connection changed everything. Within months, I was working on hotel interiors, projects that gave me both creative freedom and recognition. My designs were featured in a local magazine. Maya was thrilled. Daniel was proud. And me? For the first time in my life, I was proud of myself. Then came the moment that brought my father's world back into mine. The invitation. It came in a neat ivory envelope, addressed to me and Daniel. The Lang's annual charity gala, it said. Formal attire required. Normally, I might have declined. But when I read the list of sponsors at the bottom, my heart skipped. Among them, Robert Hawley Construction. My father's company. Daniel noticed my expression. What is it? I handed him the card. He raised an eyebrow. Your father's company? Yes, I traced the embossed logo with my finger. He'll be there. Daniel watched me for a moment, then asked gently, Do you want to go? I hesitated. Part of me didn't, but another part, the quiet, resolved part, said yes. Not out of anger, not to prove anything, but because I was no longer that woman who had been humiliated in front of a crowd. I was someone new. Someone who had rebuilt herself without needing anyone's approval. I want to go, I said finally. The night of the gala felt like the closing of a circle. I wore a dark emerald gown, simple but elegant, and Daniel looked sharp in his suit. As we entered the ballroom, the familiar hum of chatter and music hit me, a strange echo of that other night years ago. The Langs greeted us warmly. The event was grand, chandeliers, white linens, soft jazz playing in the background. I mingled with other designers, investors, and business owners. My name actually meant something now. People introduced me as the designer behind the new Lang boutique. And then I saw him. My father, standing near the bar, gray streaks in his hair, posture still straight, voice still commanding. He was speaking to a group of men, laughing in that familiar, confident tone. For a second, I froze. My heart raced, not out of fear, but out of recognition. I hadn't seen him in 2 years, and yet nothing about him had changed. Daniel placed a hand on my back. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said softly. I just didn't expect to feel so calm. We didn't approach him immediately. Instead, I focused on the event. I spoke with the Langs, took photos, smiled for the press. My father saw me eventually. I knew the moment his eyes landed on me because his voice faltered mid-sentence. He looked at Daniel next, then back at me. His expression was unreadable, a mix of surprise and something else. Maybe guilt, maybe pride. Later that evening, when most of the crowd had shifted toward the dinner tables, he approached us. "Nora," he said quietly, as though testing the sound of my name. "It's been a while." I turned to him, my smile polite but steady. "It has." "How have you been, Dad?" He hesitated before answering. "Good, busy, business is steady." "That's good," I said calmly. There was no tremor in my voice, no lingering anger, just peace. He looked at Daniel next. "Daniel," he said, giving a small nod. "Congratulations on your promotion. I heard about it." Daniel smiled slightly. "Thank you, sir." For a moment, none of us spoke. The air was heavy with everything unsaid, the years lost, the wounds unacknowledged. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "I didn't know you were involved with the Lang project." "I designed the interiors," I said simply. "They've been wonderful clients." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning me as though trying to understand this version of me, the woman who no longer needed his approval. "You've done well for yourself," he said after a pause. I smiled. "Thank you." "We both have." I looked at Daniel, who smiled back, his eyes soft but proud. There was no revenge in my tone, no bitterness, just truth. My father opened his mouth as if to say more, maybe an apology, maybe a justification, but the host called everyone to take their seats for dinner. As we sat at our table, Daniel leaned close and whispered, "You handled that beautifully." I smiled faintly. "The best revenge," I said quietly, "is peace." But deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. My father's eyes had told me there was more to come, perhaps regret, perhaps realization. Whatever it was, I wasn't running from it anymore. This was only the calm before the full circle. The days after the charity gala passed with an unusual stillness. It felt as if something invisible had shifted, not dramatically, but quietly, like a soft rearrangement of pieces on a chessboard. My father had seen me again, truly seen me, not as the disappointed daughter he had exiled, but as a woman who had built a life without his help. I hadn't planned to prove anything. But life, in its own poetic way, had placed me on a stage where my peace spoke louder than any words could. 2 weeks after the gala, I received an unexpected call. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized it before answering. "Hello?" A pause. Then, "Nora, it's your father." I froze for a heartbeat, then leaned against the kitchen counter. "Hi, Dad." His voice was measured, careful. "I wanted to thank you for coming to the event. It was good to see you." It was such a simple sentence, but I could hear the weight beneath it. Gratitude wasn't a language my father spoke easily. "I'm glad we ran into each other," I said evenly. He hesitated before adding, "You've done." "Well, I heard from the Langs that your designs are being featured in another project of theirs. Congratulations." I smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity." There was a silence, the kind that stretches between people who don't quite know how to bridge the past. Then he said, "I was wondering if we could meet sometime. Just the two of us." That caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep the boundary that had finally brought me peace. But another part of me, the part that still longed for understanding, hesitated. "When?" I asked. "Whenever you're free, lunch maybe?" I glanced at the clock. "Tomorrow works," and just like that, the conversation ended. That night, I told Daniel about it. He listened quietly, his eyes steady on mine. "How do you feel about it?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I don't want to reopen old wounds, but maybe." Maybe it's time to hear what he has to say. Daniel nodded. Then go, but promise me one thing, don't let him pull you back into the version of yourself he preferred. You've grown past that. I smiled, touched by his understanding. I promise. The next day, I met my father at a small restaurant downtown. It was the kind of place he used to dismiss as too modern, clean lines, quiet music, soft lighting. He was already there when I arrived, sitting straight-backed as always, his suit perfectly pressed. Nora, he greeted, standing as I approached. Dad, we sat. The waiter poured water and left us alone. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, breaking the silence. You've changed. I tilted my head slightly. I hope so. He gave a small nod. You seem calm, collected. I smiled faintly. Peace does that to you. He looked down at his hands. I owe you an apology. Those were not words I expected to hear from Robert Hawley. For a second, I just stared at him. He continued, his voice quiet but steady. I shouldn't have said what I did at the party. It was cruel and it was wrong. I was angry that you chose a life I didn't understand. I thought I was protecting you from hardship, but all I did was hurt you. I felt a lump rise in my throat. You didn't just hurt me, Dad. You humiliated me. You made me feel small in front of everyone I grew up with. He winced. I know. And I've thought about that night every day since. Have you? I asked softly. Because for a long time, it felt like you forgot I existed. He didn't deny it. I didn't know how to fix it. Pride's a dangerous thing, Nora. It keeps you from seeing clearly. I leaned back, studying him. He looked older than I remembered, not just physically, but emotionally. There was something weary in his expression, something that came from years of carrying the wrong kind of pride. What made you reach out now? I asked. He hesitated, then said, I saw you at the gala. You were confident, composed. People spoke highly of you. I realized that you didn't need my approval anymore, and that hurt, because it made me see how much I'd missed. That honesty caught me off guard. It wasn't the defensive tone I was used to. It was softer, stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. I didn't want to prove anything, I said after a moment. I just wanted peace. I can see that now. He looked down, his hands tightening around his glass. Daniel's a good man. I was wrong about him, I smiled faintly. He is. He's always treated me with respect, even when I didn't respect myself. My father nodded slowly. You made the right choice. I was too blind to see it. The conversation stretched on, weaving between apology and understanding. It wasn't perfect, forgiveness rarely is, but for the first time in years, it felt real. When we finished, he asked quietly, would you and Daniel come to dinner next weekend? Your mother would like to see you. I hesitated, memories of that night flashing briefly in my mind. But I saw sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't the same man who had stood on that stage and told me to leave. All right, I said. We'll come. He smiled, a small tentative smile that reminded me of the father I had known as a child. That dinner became a turning point. When Daniel and I arrived, my mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. You look wonderful, she said, her eyes glossy. Inside, the table was set beautifully. My father had even cooked part of the meal himself, something he hadn't done in years. The atmosphere was nervous at first, cautious, polite, but gradually it softened. Ethan joked. Sarah complimented my dress. Even my father laughed. At one point, Daniel stepped out to take a call, and my father leaned toward me. You know, he said, I've been thinking about something. What's that? I'm planning to expand the company, open a design and architecture division. I'd like to hire someone to lead it. Someone with vision? I looked at him, unsure where this was going. He smiled slightly. Someone like you. I blinked. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership, he said carefully. Not as charity, as recognition. You've built something remarkable, Nora. You understand people, spaces, and the kind of modern thinking our company needs. I didn't answer immediately. Part of me felt proud, another part wary. Dad, I said gently, I appreciate that, but I need to think about it. I've worked hard to build something on my own. I can't just give that up. He nodded. I understand. I'm not asking you to give it up. I'm asking if you'd consider helping me rebuild our family's name together this time. It was strange hearing him talk about family not as a burden, but as a team. I told him I'd think about it. That night, Daniel and I talked for hours. I think he's trying, I said. I can see it. He's changed. Daniel smiled gently. Maybe, but remember, change takes consistency, not one dinner. He was right. So I waited. I didn't rush into anything. Over the next few months, my father and I spoke more often about work, life, even little things like favorite recipes or books. It was awkward sometimes, but it was progress. One afternoon, I visited his office, the same one I'd once been too nervous to enter as a teenager. His assistant smiled when she saw me. He's been expecting you. When I stepped inside, I noticed something new. The old framed photos of construction sites had been replaced with prints of architectural renderings, sleek, modern designs. My designs. You put these up? I asked, surprised. He looked up from his desk, smiling. They inspire me. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The man who once mocked Daniel's ambition was now looking at my work as a model for his own growth. It was surreal. We spent hours discussing his plans. He was serious about modernizing his company, about integrating design and sustainability, things he used to dismiss. And then he said something that caught me off guard. You know, when I told you to leave that night, I thought I was protecting my reputation. But all I did was destroy something much more valuable, our trust. You showed me what real strength looks like, Nora. Quiet, steady, and graceful. I'll never forget that. For the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a grand confession. It was real. And in that moment, I forgave him, not because he asked for it, but because I finally understood that forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. I agreed to collaborate with his company on a few projects. Not as a daughter working for her father, but as a professional and equal. And as we worked together, something unexpected happened. We began to rebuild not just a business, but a relationship. There were still moments of tension, of course, old habits die hard. But there was respect now, mutual respect. And one evening, after a long day of meetings, my father said quietly, I'm proud of you, Nora, I mean that. I smiled. Thank you. It only took a few years. He chuckled softly. Better late than never. Later that night, I sat on the balcony with Daniel, the city lights glittering below. You did it, he said, wrapping his arm around me. Not through anger or revenge, but through patience. Through grace, I smiled, resting my head against him. I guess that's the thing about calm revenge. It's not about destroying someone. It's about proving you never needed to. When Daniel and I came back home that night, the silence between us was heavier than usual. The echoes of laughter and clinking glasses from the party still haunted me. I could still hear my father's voice, cold, decisive, dismissing me as though I were some uninvited stranger in my own family. I remember sitting by the window that night, staring out into the dark, thinking how a single evening could change the shape of everything I thought I knew about love, family, and belonging. Daniel quietly placed a cup of tea beside me. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. There was a calmness in his eyes that told me he was planning something, though I couldn't yet see what. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth soothe me, but inside I was still trembling. Not from sadness anymore, but from something sharper, something that felt a lot like clarity. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. My eyes were swollen from crying, but I didn't want to cry anymore. I wanted to understand. I wanted to remember every detail of that night, not to torture myself with it, but to see it for what it really was, a moment when truth came to the surface. My father didn't just embarrass me. He revealed what he had been feeling for years. To him, I was always the lesser one, the daughter who should have married for convenience, not love. The daughter who should have stayed close, quiet, and obedient. When Daniel joined me at the breakfast table, he was unusually serious. Nora, he said, looking directly into my eyes, we're not going to let this break you. But we're not going to run from it either. I asked him what he meant, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Your father is trying to make you feel small because he still thinks he can control you. But he can't, not anymore. I know you don't want revenge in the ugly sense, but you do deserve to reclaim your dignity, your peace. His words sank deep into me. I nodded slowly, unsure what reclaiming my dignity would look like, but knowing he was right. In the days that followed, I tried to move on with work and routine, but my mind kept circling back to the party, to the whispers, to the humiliation. I didn't tell anyone else what happened. Even my mother didn't call to ask if I was okay, which hurt more than anything. Daniel noticed the way I avoided my phone. He knew I was waiting for an apology that wasn't coming. Then, one evening, as we sat together after dinner, he said something that startled me. Nora, maybe it's time they see who you really are. Not the girl your father wants you to be, but the woman you've become. You've spent your whole life trying to earn his approval. Maybe it's time to stop asking for it and show him that you never needed it. I stared at him for a long moment. The idea made me nervous, but also strangely powerful. What do you mean? I asked. He smiled faintly. You'll see. But it starts with you walking back into that world, not to beg, but to show them what they lost when they decided to look down on you. The next few weeks were quietly transformative. Daniel and I started working on something together, a project that would become the turning point of everything. Daniel owned a small architecture firm, and I'd always helped him with design concepts and presentations. This time, we decided to bid for a big community development contract in the city, one that would bring jobs, sustainable housing, and a lot of attention. We worked late nights, side by side. It wasn't just about work anymore. It was about purpose. Every line I drew, every paragraph I wrote in the proposal felt like a step toward reclaiming a piece of myself. It was as if I was building, brick by brick, the life my father never thought I could have. But it wasn't easy. The proposal was intense, and the competition included some powerful names, including my father's company. I didn't even realize it at first until Daniel pointed it out. Look, he said, showing me the list of bidders. Silver Ridge Holdings, that's your father's firm, isn't it? My stomach turned. It was. The same company that once dismissed my ideas when I worked there briefly after college. The same company that made me feel invisible at board meetings because I wasn't to be one of the sons carrying the family legacy. Suddenly, it all made sense. Daniel wasn't just trying to distract me from my pain. He was giving me a chance to channel it into something meaningful. This wasn't revenge out of spite. This was about showing that the daughter he threw away could build something greater than what he ever imagined. For weeks, we poured ourselves into that project. There were nights when I barely slept. The designs had to be perfect, modern yet sustainable, elegant yet practical. I handled the presentation deck, crafting every word carefully. I wanted it to reflect not just skill, but integrity. When the day of the pitch came, I was nervous but calm. We walked into the city's development office together, hand in hand. The room was full of people in suits, each team waiting for their turn to present. And there, sitting across the room, was my father. He noticed me instantly. His eyes narrowed, not with curiosity, but with irritation. He didn't say a word, but I could feel his judgment across the distance. My mother was beside him, silent as always. For a brief second, my heart wavered. I wanted to walk away to avoid the confrontation. But Daniel gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. When our turn came, we stood before the panel and began. Daniel opened with the technical side, the figures, the environmental impact, the long-term community value. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward and started speaking, not from a script, but from conviction. As I spoke, I could see my father's expression change. I talked about growth, about rebuilding communities with dignity, about second chances, words that carried more weight for me than for anyone else in that room. My voice didn't shake, not even once. By the end of the presentation, there was silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when something genuine has been said. When we walked out, Daniel whispered, "That was incredible." I smiled, but my heart was pounding. I didn't know if we would win the contract, but I knew we'd already won something else, respect. A week later, the results came in. We got the project. I remember sitting in our kitchen when the email arrived. I read it twice, then 3 times. I couldn't believe it. "Daniel," I whispered, tears in my eyes. "We did it." He hugged me, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. News spread quickly in the business circle, and eventually it reached my father. I knew it when I got a call from an unknown number. His voice was the same, calm but distant. "I heard you got the city project," he said. "Congratulations." It wasn't an apology, but it was something. A crack in his armor, perhaps. That night, Daniel told me, "This isn't just about beating your father's company. It's about showing yourself that you were never the problem." He was right. But deep inside, I knew my father's silence wasn't over. And I was right, because 2 weeks later, another family gathering invitation arrived. This time, it was for my father's 60th birthday. I looked at the invitation for a long time, unsure whether to go. The memory of the last party still stung, but something inside me whispered that maybe it was time to face him again. Not for him, but for me. Daniel looked at the invitation and simply said, "If you go, go as the woman you are now." Not the daughter he threw out. I smiled faintly. Then I guess it's time to remind him. And that's when the real revenge, the calm kind, the kind that doesn't destroy but transforms, truly began to unfold. Because I wasn't going there to argue. I wasn't going there to cry. I was going to let my peace, my success, and my composure speak louder than any words ever could. And deep down, I knew that this time when I walked into that room, they wouldn't see the broken daughter anymore. They'd see the woman who rose from the ashes of their rejection and turned it into quiet power. The day of my father's 60th birthday came faster than I expected. For weeks, the invitations sat on the kitchen counter like a quiet test, daring me to decide who I wanted to be when I faced my family again. I wasn't nervous in the way I used to be. This time, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about showing up as myself without apology, without shame. The morning of the event, Daniel found me standing in front of the mirror, adjusting my dress. It wasn't fancy, just a simple, elegant navy gown that fit me perfectly. My hair was tied back, my makeup subtle. I didn't want to look extravagant. I wanted to look composed. Daniel stood behind me and placed his hands gently on my shoulders. "You look like someone who has already won," he said softly. I smiled faintly. Maybe because I finally stopped trying to win their approval. He nodded. "Exactly. You don't owe them your pain anymore." We left the house around 6 in the evening. The sky was painted in shades of gold and violet as the sun began to set. The drive to my parents' house was strangely calm. I had thought I'd feel my chest tighten or that I'd rehearse words in my head. But I didn't. The silence between us was peaceful. When we arrived, the house looked exactly the same as the night of the family party. Bright lights, expensive cars parked along the driveway, and the faint sound of music spilling from inside. But this time, I felt like I was looking at it from a distance, even though I was standing right there. As we entered, the first thing I noticed was the smell of roses and vanilla candles. My mother had always loved decorating for events. She was standing near the grand staircase, talking to a few relatives. When she saw me, her expression froze for a second, not with anger, but with uncertainty. Then she smiled faintly, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be warm. "Nora," she said softly. "You came." I nodded. "Of course, Mom, it's Dad's big day." Daniel greeted her politely, and she smiled at him too, her eyes flickering between us, as if remembering how he had defended me the last time. The living room was full of relatives, cousins, uncles, aunts, people I hadn't seen since childhood. The same ones who had looked away when my father humiliated me at the last gathering. I could feel their eyes on me now, cautious, curious, whispering quietly among themselves. I didn't let it bother me. I greeted a few of them calmly, smiled where I needed to, and stayed close to Daniel. My father hadn't noticed me yet. He was across the room talking to a group of business associates. When he finally turned and saw me, his expression didn't reveal much. He paused, gave me a polite nod, and said, "You made it." "Yes," I said. "Happy birthday, Dad." He smiled, but it wasn't the warm kind of smile. It was careful, practiced. "Thank you," he said, glancing at Daniel. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I met his gaze steadily. "You invited me." I thought it would be rude not to. There was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. For once, I wasn't shrinking before him. I was standing tall, my tone calm and steady. He looked at me for a moment longer before saying, "Enjoy yourself," and turning back to his guests. Daniel leaned toward me and whispered, "That went better than expected." I smiled slightly. For now. As the evening unfolded, I watched my father work the room, shaking hands, making toasts, laughing. He looked proud and in control, the way he always did at family events. But something was different this time. When people came up to congratulate him, I heard snippets of conversation floating around the room, people talking about the new city development project, about Daniel and me, about how our firm had won it. It wasn't arrogance that made me listen. It was quiet satisfaction. I wasn't spreading the news, they were. It had traveled through the same circle that once doubted me. My father, of course, must have known. I could tell by the way he avoided the subject all evening. Every time someone brought it up, he changed the topic smoothly. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more it hovered around him. Then something unexpected happened. My uncle, the same one who had laughed that night when my father told me to leave, raised his glass toward me. "I hear you've been doing great things, Nora," he said with a grin. "That city project, right?" "Congratulations." The room grew a little quieter. My father stiffened slightly beside him. I smiled and nodded. Thank you. It's been a meaningful project. Someone else joined in. Wasn't your father's company also bidding for that one? A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. My father cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. Yes, but business is business. The city chose the best proposal, I'm sure. His words were smooth, but his eyes flickered with restrained annoyance. Daniel stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Actually, it's been an honor to work on it together. Nora's ideas really shaped the design. She has a way of seeing details that most people overlook. I felt my cheeks warm slightly, not from embarrassment, but from pride. The room fell quiet again. I saw people exchange glances, the same ones who had thought Daniel was too quiet, too ordinary to stand beside a woman like me. Now they were seeing the truth, that he wasn't ordinary, he was extraordinary in ways that mattered. My father gave a tight smile. Yes, Nora always had a creative mind, he said. But perhaps this will teach her the value of structure and discipline too. It was subtle, but I heard the dig. The old tone, the one that always managed to sound like praise and criticism at once. But instead of reacting, I just smiled gently. You're right, Dad, I did learn structure and discipline. Mostly from you, actually, I just applied them differently. There was a pause. My father didn't respond. The tension was quiet but unmistakable. A few guests shifted awkwardly, pretending to sip their drinks. Daniel took my hand lightly, his thumb brushing over mine, grounding me. We didn't need to say anything else. The silence said it all. Later in the evening, after the cake was cut and the music softened, my father approached me privately near the terrace. The guests were inside dancing and talking. The night air was cool and the sound of distant laughter floated out the open doors. He stood beside me, looking out into the garden. You've done well, he said quietly. Thank you, I replied. He was silent for a moment. You know, when I told you to leave that night, I didn't mean to humiliate you. I just thought you were making mistakes. I thought Daniel wasn't the right man for you. I looked at him calmly. And what do you think now? He hesitated. I think. Maybe I judged too quickly. You've proven yourself. His tone wasn't warm, but it was honest in a restrained way. That was the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get from him, and strangely, I didn't need more. I didn't need to prove myself, Dad, I said softly. I just needed to live my life. You don't have to understand every choice I made, just respect that they were mine to make. He looked at me for a long moment, then gave a small nod. You sound just like your mother, he said, half smiling. Stubborn and calm at the same time, I smiled too. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. For the first time, he laughed, a real quiet laugh. When we drove home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because my father had changed completely, but because I no longer needed him to. I had learned that forgiveness wasn't about pretending it never hurt. It was about not letting the hurt define me anymore. Over the next few months, my relationship with my family began to shift. Slowly, cautiously. My mother started calling more often. My father even visited our office once, under the pretense of checking the progress of the project. It was awkward, but I could see that he was trying. And as for me, I had stopped being the woman who waited for approval. I became the woman who created her own peace. One evening, I sat with Daniel in our backyard, watching the sunset. The light painted everything gold. I turned to him and said, you know, if someone told me a year ago that my revenge would come through peace, not anger, I wouldn't have believed it. He smiled. But a calm kind always lasts longer. I leaned my head on his shoulder and whispered, then I guess we did it right. The world outside was quiet, but inside me, everything was finally in harmony. I didn't get revenge by shouting or by hurting anyone. I got it by standing tall, by succeeding quietly, and by living the kind of life that no humiliation could take away from me. And in that calm, I found my victory. In the months that followed my father's birthday, life began to settle into something new, something balanced. The old restlessness that used to sit quietly at the back of my chest, whispering that I wasn't enough, had gone silent. For the first time in years, my mornings felt light. I would wake up early, make tea, and watch Daniel reading the news by the kitchen window. There was peace in our home, and that peace felt earned, not given. That peace doesn't mean life stops moving. It means you move with it, gracefully, deliberately. And that's exactly what I tried to do. The city development project was in full swing, and it drew more attention than we had expected. There were interviews, features in local newspapers, and even a few business magazines that reached out to us. I wasn't used to being the center of attention, but Daniel encouraged me to embrace it. "This is your work," he said, "your story. Own it." At first, I hesitated. I didn't want it to seem like I was trying to outshine anyone, especially my father. But eventually, I realized this wasn't about outshining anyone. It was about standing in the light I had created for myself. So I agreed to a small interview for a local paper. They asked me about my background, the challenges I faced as a woman in business, and what motivated me. I answered honestly, calmly. I didn't mention my father's name or the history between us, but I did say something that came straight from my heart. Sometimes, the greatest form of strength is not in fighting back loudly, but in quietly rebuilding what was broken. In letting your work, your character, and your peace speak louder than your pain. When the article was published, it spread faster than I imagined. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. Old colleagues congratulated me. Even some of my relatives sent polite messages. But the most surprising reaction came from my father himself. He called one evening, his voice unusually soft. "I read your interview," he said. I hesitated before responding. "Oh, I didn't expect you to." "It was good," he said. "You've grown into someone very grounded." There was a pause. "I suppose I never made that easy for you." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close enough. My heart softened. "You did what you thought was right," I said gently. "We all did." He sighed quietly. "Maybe, still, I'm proud of you." That was the first time I had ever heard those words from him. They came without conditions, without pride hiding behind them. Just simple human honesty. I didn't cry, though my throat tightened. I thanked him, and after a few more words, we ended the call. When I told Daniel about it later, he smiled in that calm, knowing way of his. "You see?" he said. "You didn't need to fight and to win. You just needed to become someone even he couldn't ignore anymore." He was right. My revenge, if I could even call it that, had never been about making my father suffer. It was about reclaiming the parts of me that had been silenced. It was about standing tall in my own story. Still, as time went on, I realized that some scars linger quietly beneath the surface. Even though my father had softened, there were moments when his old pride peeked through. He still found ways to give backhanded compliments, still struggled to accept that I no longer needed his approval. But now it didn't bother me the way it once did. His words no longer had power over how I saw myself. One afternoon a few months later, my father invited Daniel and me to lunch. It was just the three of us. My mother had gone to visit my sister, and he wanted, as he put it, a quiet conversation. We met at his favorite old restaurant, the same one where he used to take me as a child when I'd done well in school. The waiter greeted him by name like always. He looked a little older that day, a little slower, though he tried to hide it behind his usual formal posture. "I've been thinking a lot about things," he said after we ordered. "About family. About the way I handled things with you." I stayed silent, letting him continue. "You know," he said slowly, "I spent my whole life believing that respect was something you demanded. That control kept things in order. I thought being strong meant being feared, but lately, I've realized strength can look different." I listened quietly, my hands folded on the table. "You didn't shout, you didn't argue. You didn't come back begging to be understood. You just lived. And somehow, that's what changed everything." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of quiet music filled the space between us. Finally, I said softly, "Maybe that's the kind of strength we both needed to learn." He nodded. "Maybe so." After lunch, as we stood outside, he looked at Daniel and said, "You've done well by her. Thank you for standing by her when I couldn't." Daniel simply nodded and said, "She didn't need me to fight for her, just beside her." That was one of those moments I would remember forever. It was the kind of healing that doesn't come from grand gestures, but from acknowledgement, the quiet kind that settles into your heart like sunlight after a long storm. From then on, my father and I began rebuilding our relationship, not from nostalgia or guilt, but from respect. We spoke more often, but never forced conversations. We let things flow naturally. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Life at home, too, found a deeper rhythm. Daniel and I expanded the firm. We hired young designers from underrepresented backgrounds, people who reminded me of my younger self, full of ideas but unsure if they were enough. I wanted to give them what I had once needed, space to be seen, to be valued. And sometimes late at night when the office was quiet and the lights glowed over the empty desks, I'd stand by the window remembering that night at the family party, the laughter the glass raised my father's cold words. It all felt so far away now, like another lifetime. I didn't regret any of it. Not anymore. Because that night, painful as it was, had been the beginning of everything that followed. The breaking point that turned into a starting point. One evening, nearly a year later, Daniel and I were invited to a charity gala for urban development. I didn't think much of it at first. We attended such events often now. But when we arrived, I noticed something unexpected. My father was there too. He had been invited as a keynote speaker for his long-standing contributions to the city's architecture. During his speech, he spoke about legacy, leadership, and responsibility. Then, near the end, he said something that caught me off guard. "There comes a time," he said, looking out at the audience, "when you realize that strength isn't about having the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing when to listen." I learned that from someone close to me, my daughter. She taught me that quiet resolve can change more than anger ever could. The audience applauded politely, but for me, time seemed to pause. Our eyes met briefly across the room. He smiled, not the proud, distant smile of the man who once dismissed me, but a genuine, quiet one. I felt tears welling in my eyes, not of sadness, but of release. Later that night, as we drove home, Daniel took my hand. "How does it feel?" he asked softly, "to know that your calm changed everything?" I looked out at the city lights flickering past and said, "It feels like freedom." He smiled, squeezing my hand. "That's the best kind of revenge, isn't it?" I laughed quietly. "Yes, the kind that doesn't destroy anyone, just restores what was taken." From that night on, I stopped thinking of it as revenge. It was never really about revenge. It was about peace, the kind of peace that comes when you rise above what tried to break you. Years passed, and life continued with its quiet rhythm. My relationship with my father settled into something honest and human. We never revisited that painful night, but we didn't need to. The silence between us had been replaced with understanding. Sometimes when he visited our office, I would catch him looking at me with quiet pride. Once he even said to one of my interns, "If you ever want to learn how to handle pressure with grace, watch her. She does it better than anyone I know." Those words meant more than any apology could. Now, as I look back, I realize that revenge doesn't always look like a confrontation or a triumphant declaration. Sometimes it looks like peace. It sounds like laughter returning to your home after years of silence. It feels like forgiving someone who never said sorry, because you no longer need them to. I didn't win by shouting back at the world that hurt me. I won by not letting it change who I am. And that, I think, is the calmest, most beautiful kind of revenge there is. So if you've ever been in a moment like mine, humiliated, dismissed, made to feel small, remember this. You don't have to destroy anyone to rise. You just have to keep walking, keep building, and keep your heart steady. Let your peace speak louder than their judgment. Because one day when you found your place, when you're standing tall in your own story, the world that once looked down on you will have no choice but to look up. And when that day comes, you won't need to say a single word. You'll just smile quietly, knowing you found your calm revenge. Thank you for listening to my story. If you felt something in it, if you've ever faced a moment like mine, I hope it reminded you that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just breathes quietly and keeps moving. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge for more stories like this, stories of quiet strength, redemption, and dignity. Because sometimes the calmest hearts hold the loudest victories.